So, Madeline, a very warm welcome. A welcome to everyone who's here in the room. For those of you who don't know me, my name is James Milner. I have the real privilege of being the program director for the Migration and Diaspora Studies program here at Carleton University and the project director for LEARN, the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. And my thanks to NUMSA from MDS, from Nadia and Lily and Beatrice from the LEARN project for all of your help in promoting this event. My thanks to all of you for being here. But another hat that I wear is something called the De Mello Chair. This is an initiative that was started by the government of Brazil and is now supported by GAIN, the Global Academic Interdisciplinary Network. And this is an effort to reimagine how universities can contribute to protection and solutions and solidarity with refugees and other forcibly displaced. And so it's in this context that I'm really delighted that when Madeline was anticipating a mission here to Canada, that Carleton was included as a stop along the way. Madeline, I'm doubly grateful for your willingness to join us remotely, just as I'm grateful for Carol and Azadeh from, who I'll introduce in a moment, being with us from UNHCR. So let me begin by recognizing that the land where we're gathered is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I say that not just out of protocol and respect, but out of a deep recognition of how the land where we are deeply caught up with these questions of dispossession, dislocation, and efforts at reconciliation. When you help yourself to lunch, peek through the blinds and you'll see the Rideau River that flows behind us. This has been a route of migration and exchange for time immemorial, and a recognition that migration and mobility is part of human history for hundreds of thousands of years. And so not something to be feared, but something to be understood in context of the many forces that are at play around us. And it's these forces at play that are around us that really is the focus of the timing of this conversation and Madeline, our invitation to you today. And really thinking about these critical themes in global forced migration policy today. And today being a time of uncertainty and unpredictability in the world, but in particular for the norms and institutions of the global refugee regime. Let's remember this regime was established by states themselves in the aftermath of World War II to respond to the needs of 55 million people displaced in Europe in the aftermath of that war. States themselves agreed to these core principles of non-refoulement, not to forcibly return refugees to a country where they fear persecution, and agreed in establishing an international organization, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. As I was saying, that it's states who created the UNHCR, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, to ensure protection for refugees and to help find a solution to their plight, but ultimately to facilitate cooperation. Between all those actors that are needed to be involved in this pursuit of protection and solutions. And the regime has proven to be remarkably resilient, from its origins, from focusing on Europe to a global focus through the end of the Cold War. We think of the incredible instances of comprehensive solutions that we saw for Indo-Chinese refugees, Central American refugees, but also much more recently in making the case for cooperation with the New York Declaration, with the Global Compact on Refugees, and just in December 2023, in seeing the remarkable response from states, non-state actors, the private sector, academics, non-governmental organizations, refugee-led organizations at the Global Refugee Forum in Geneva, thousands of participants and hundreds of pledges that were made to reinforce these timeless principles of protection, solutions, and also of assistance. But it is a time of uncertainty with not just elections with our immediate neighbor, but with a shift around the world where we've seen a rise in political actors that place more of an emphasis on power over principles, place more of an emphasis on interests over cooperation, unilateralism over multilateralism. So it's at a time when the founders of the regime in the global north are themselves backing away from those very principles that they committed to uphold with the establishment of the regime, placing additional pressures on states in the global south who host 76% of the world's refugees. It's also at a time when displacement levels are at record numbers and the need for cooperation is greater than ever. So how do we face these challenges today of the enduring need for protection and solutions, and at a time of the political environment where we find ourselves? How enduring are these fundamental principles of the regime? And are these principles up to the challenge? So we're really fortunate, Madeline, to have you with us virtually today. As many of you know, Madeline is the Chief of Protection Policy and Legal Advice in the Division of International Protection at UNHCR in Geneva. She's previously served as the Assistant Representative for Protection for UNHCR in Iraq, as UNHCR's liaison with EU institutions for many years. And on a personal note, I have to say, Madeline and I sit together on the editorial board of the Refugee Survey Quarterly. We've been very involved together in discussions about the role of the global academic interdisciplinary network. I have always valued Madeline's candor and her insight, but her genuine belief in the value of engaging with academic discussions. So Madeline, in the room today, we have students, graduate students at Carleton University, members, very active members of the university community and community partners who are with us. We're also very fortunate to be joined by Carol and by Azadeh. Carol is the Senior Legal Advisor with UNHCR headquarters in Geneva, but also has a role closer to home in your profile. Prior to joining UNHCR, she was Director of the Refugee Law Office of Legal Aid Ontario. So perhaps has some insight in working locally and globally as well. And Azadeh, a great friend of what we do here at Carleton University, is a Senior Legal Officer with UNHCR Canada, who's worked with UNHCR since 2017. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pass the floor, Madeline, to you for your comments of about half an hour. I'll invite comments and reactions from Carol, from Azadeh. I may have some points as well. We'll then open it up for discussion, and then we'll go back, Madeline, to you and colleagues for any closing comments in about an hour and 5 minutes or so. So Madeline, if that works for you, I'm happy to pass the virtual floor and keen to hear your thoughts. Madeline, over to you.
Thank you so much, James. And really let me thank Carleton University, the Migration and Diaspora Studies Program, the Learn Network, and all of the participants there for their time and presence. Also for being flexible and ready to host me virtually. It's a great opportunity for me to hear from you and for us to exchange. When I learned about the theme of this series, critical themes in global forced migration, I proposed that it might be interesting to share some thoughts and to exchange with you today about the admittedly broad, but nonetheless, I think, very timely topic of the future of international refugee protection. And I want to focus on the international refugee law regime, but in particular, the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. And James, you've already framed that, I think, this discussion very well in historical and in global and geopolitical terms. And I think it's important for us to talk about this today because there's no question that the challenges facing the refugee protection system at international level and at national level in many countries are vast. And let me just perhaps mention a few of them from our perspective at HCR. Firstly, there's the scale of global displacement today. Nearly 123 million people were displaced as of mid-2024. Many are having fled from 60 active conflicts across 90 states. So that's nearly 3 times the number of those that were displaced at the end of World War II when the 1951 Convention was first discussed and adopted. In addition to this vast scale of displacement, we also see the terrible intractability of some of its root causes. We've seen too often in recent years that new wars break out while existing conflicts continue or reignite. And some of the most devastating violence that we see right now, which is causing displacement all around the world, have their roots in decades-long situations of conflict and tension, including in Sudan, in the Middle East, in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, in Yemen, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in an increasing number of new and protracted crises, we also see grave breaches of international humanitarian law in Myanmar, in Ukraine, in Eastern DRC, and in Sudan, amongst others. And this includes the systematic use of prohibited methods of warfare, disregard of core principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality, attacks on civilian and civilian infrastructure, coupled with the widespread use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. We also see very significant challenges due to the complexity of human movement today. Many of the drivers of displacement we see around the world are interconnected. Conflict, climate change, economic instability all fuel complex and mixed population flows. And this means that individuals fleeing persecution and conflict are frequently traveling alongside individuals who move for a wide range of other reasons, often for multiple reasons at once, including some people in search of better opportunities in life. But regardless, people on the move, whether in their own country or across borders, are all being exposed to the same risks of exploitation, serious harm, and even death along perilous routes. And these egregious human rights violations lay down the challenge for all of us in the UN, in the wider community that is interested in forced displacement, because all people on the move are entitled to protection for their human rights, regardless of status, something that the international community has affirmed recently in the New York Declaration, in the Global Compact on Refugees, and the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. And as a final challenge that we see all too starkly in this environment, we have, of course, the extraordinarily difficult political environment. And this is visible in countries in both the global north and the global south. We've seen the rise of extremism and nationalist and xenophobic rhetoric in many countries, and regrettably, limited political will to fulfill the obligations that states have taken on voluntarily. So against this very sobering backdrop, it's important to look at the place of the 1951 Convention at this point in time. And we need to do this also because some observers, including politicians, recurrently question its relevance and applicability to today's context. Some argue that nearly 75 years after it was drafted, in the aftermath of World War II, the 1951 Convention is no longer suited to the realities of globalization, large-scale human movement, geopolitical complexities, and other challenges we see today. But if we step back from it, this is an interesting argument because it seems to imply that back in the 1940s, the environment was conducive, that things were straightforward, that there were resources, agreement, and political willingness to protect refugees that are not evident now. But of course, the reality couldn't have been further from the truth. Europe was in physical, economic, and in some ways social ruin. There were real tensions between countries which had been at war just a few years earlier. Many politicians and publics harbored grave fears about what receiving refugees could mean for them. And yet, the international community at that time recognized it was essential to adopt the convention relating to the status of refugees and establish an international refugee protection regime, not only out of a spirit of altruism and humanitarianism, but because they recognized it was in states' interests to do so. As recognized in the preamble to the 1951 Convention, in its paragraph 4 in particular, this was a recognition that international cooperation was going to be essential to deal with the problems facing refugees and confronting states as they dealt with movements, recognizing that this was a challenge which was international by its very scope and nature and would require states to work together going forward. So in response to the claim that the 1951 Convention is no longer relevant, I can say very clearly that it's the view of UNHCR and indeed many others that the 1951 Convention continues to have enduring relevance and applicability and may well be more needed at the moment than ever. There are many persuasive reasons to support this, and let me just mention 4. Firstly, because it represents modern state practice. The 1951 Convention and its 1967 protocol, which expanded its geographical and temporal scope, remain amongst the world's most widely ratified treaties. And I should say that right now, UNHCR is involved in discussions with 2 major non-signatory states that are considering joining it. We see the daily application of the Convention and the regional instruments that were created on its basis in countries all around the world. Millions of refugees receive protection every year, find solutions, contribute actively and productive to their host communities, as they have done over the past 70 years, and where they are leading them to become very significant contributors and leaders in many of the societies that have granted them protection. They enjoy the benefit of the catalogue of rights that the Convention established in ways that were arguably revolutionary at the time, but which really also laid the foundation for important parts of the modern human rights law framework. This adherence and respect for the Convention in practice is not always widely reported in the media or focused on by many academics. Perhaps it's not news that international parts of the international system are working as they should, but it's the reality that's widely documented by HCR and many others. And those of us who support the framework should, in our view, seek not to be drawn into repeating an overly negative prognosis for its health and application. A second reason is because the provisions of the Convention, and notably the refugee definition which it established, have been interpreted in a flexible and evolutionary way over the past few decades, in a manner that has demonstrated its ongoing relevance and applicability to address the changing forms of persecution, conflict, and human rights violations, which we see tragically as the drivers of displacement of too many people who are forced to flee across borders. And this includes forms of persecution which were not explicitly referenced or foreseen in the text by the drafters of the Convention, but which are widely recognized today by courts and decision-making authorities worldwide as falling amongst grounds which give rise to a need for protection under the refugee definition, which do give rise to a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, as the refugee definition foresees. And this includes child-specific or gender-specific forms of persecution, including recruitment of child soldiers, female genital mutilation, intimate partner violence, persecution based on sexual orientation and gender identity, persecution by traffickers, and many others. An important illustration of this is the positive way in which we see wide recognition also of the fact that people fleeing generalized conflict and violence fall within the refugee definition, an interpretation which UNHCR set out in its Guideline on International Protection, number 12, which was published in 1916. And there it explained that the vast majority of conflicts that we see today are driven or underpinned by reasons related to race, religion, nationality, or politics in ways that put entire communities at risk of persecution and serious harm. We see this today in Sudan, for example, where ethnicity and origin, such as that of non-Arab civilians from Darfur, are key elements in the conflict and expose civilians to the threat of extreme violence simply because of their backgrounds or tribal affiliations. We see this also in other examples that UNHCR has addressed in its guidance, including over the last few years and months, our international protection considerations on Myanmar, on Haiti, on Iraq, and on Syria, amongst others. And these are guidelines which are followed and are applied by states, courts, and decision makers in many instances, demonstrating the day-to-day application in very practical, real-life situations today of the Refugee Convention. Thirdly, I want to underline that the Convention on the Status of Refugees continues to demonstrate the ways in which it is equipped to deal with many of the challenges that states and societies grapple with in regards to irregular movement today, including, in some circumstances, threats to national security and public order, a key and legitimate concern of many states and publics today. This is reflected, for example, in the 1951 Convention's Article 2, which requires refugees to respect the laws of their host states. There is also Article 1F of the Convention, which excludes serious criminals and those guilty of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts contrary to the principles and purposes of the United Nations from refugee protection, by provisions that allow for the possibility for states to cancel or revoke a person's refugee status in situations where relevant, and in exceptional circumstances, permitting the expulsion of refugees posing a danger to the national security or the community of a host country under its Article 32. And this is something which UNHCR has been discussing in recent times with a number of states that have experienced significant violence in which people found to be refugees were involved. We've been seeking to recognize these states have a legitimate interest in protecting the security of their community, but in doing so in a way that ensures the correct, proportionate use of these provisions in line with human rights. And this is because national security concerns and international refugee protection are in no sense mutually exclusive. Giving primacy to security at the expense of protection has not resulted in a more secure world, which is why we need to advocate for the correct application of the Convention and the mechanisms it has in place to address these legitimate concerns in a measured and lawful way. And finally, as a fourth argument I'd like to point to, we see some of the states that have taken particularly far-reaching positions on the relevance of the Convention, who are underscoring that their concern is about a perceived lack of control and chaos in movements towards their borders and in the situation of arrivals within their territory. But from UNHCR's perspective, we would argue that the answer to deal with perceived chaotic and uncontrolled arrivals is not to step back from the only instrument that comes close to providing a universally agreed framework for dealing with such arrivals, particularly in situations where we have states that are in regions where restrictive approaches can lead to directly imposing additional strains and demands on the territories of neighbours. We need to be looking at ways in which international principles and international agreements can provide better ways to manage that, rather than saying that we can walk away from them and expect that we will get a better answer by allowing states to try to deal with these issues in unilateral and self-interested terms. So in this connection then, and looking at the theme of the future of refugee protection, I want to speak to a number of other elements that map out what we recognise as a very challenging, although not entirely negative, future for refugee protection, and for the role of the Convention in the midst of that in particular. Because these, to my mind, really underscore that refugee law principles, and specifically the 1951 Convention, the 67 Protocol, and the regional instruments that are based on it, are directly relevant and essential to manage the challenges of human movement going forward. So firstly, climate change. We're all acutely aware of the way in which climate change has the potential to and is impacting all countries worldwide, people in different circumstances all around the world, and as is increasingly recognised, is triggering and interacting with displacement and creating conditions that many people can no longer subsist on their traditional livelihoods. This means that some people may be forced to migrate as a form of adaptation. This means that countries that are hosting large populations of refugees, and indeed 76% are in low and middle income countries, are also directly impacted and in many cases placed under strains that make it difficult for them to continue to do so. Climate change is multiplying threats and exacerbating or causing tensions between communities and conflicts within states or across borders. It's affecting the ability for states to protect the human rights of their citizens, as well as refugees who might arrive and seek shelter in their borders. In this context, UNHCR underscores that not everybody who moves in the context of climate change and disaster will be a refugee, but some of them definitely are, where they fall within the international definition of a refugee because they have a well-founded fear of persecution. And we see there are many situations around the world where climate change is interacting with conflict and violence and sometimes triggering it, particularly where there is competition over scarce natural resources, arable land, access to water, or other essentials for life, a phenomenon we observe in the Sahel and parts of West and Central Africa, and in the Horn of Africa, parts of the Middle East and elsewhere. UNHCR issued guidance in the form of a legal consideration document regarding claims for international protection made in the context of the adverse effects of climate change and disaster in 2020, where we set out the situations in which we consider that the refugee definition needs to be carefully considered, where it may well have purchase. We also examined the way in which human rights law may also play a role, And the Human Rights Committee has pronounced itself on what it sees as situations which in the future could create such a threat to the right to life that this may trigger the principle of non-refoulement and thereby create obligations on states to provide protection to such people. In a note of December 2023 on climate change, international law, and UNHCR's mandate, we outlined some of the very specific circumstances in which we see these risks and the corresponding need for international protection arising around the world today. So part of our work there is seeking to promote the correct application of current law, including the 1951 Convention, in this context. And we see very significant interest on the part of judges and decision-making authorities in this question in order to help them to manage asylum claims that are increasingly arising in this context. And we also see it as particularly important that all those involved in this area need to be engaging in discussions about how to strengthen responses to many whose human rights are at risk, who may not fall within the existing refugee definition. We see a real need for us to strengthen collectively approaches to mitigating and adapting to the effects of climate change, but also to providing protection for those who are directly implicated and impacted in ways that international law will need to evolve in order to address. As a further significant situation where we see a need for strengthened responses, we see, of course, substantial mixed movements around the world, but where states have been responding in extremely restrictive ways in many countries, in ways that directly challenge the foundational principle of non-refoulement and other principles of international law. Regrettably, we see practices including pushbacks at borders, attempts to externalize asylum obligations, and criminalization of irregular movement in ways that are contrary to international law, but which are regrettably manifest in different parts of the world. Now, some of these measures have been adopted in response to the perception of chaotic, spontaneous arrivals of foreigners, which has raised public concern in some countries. And we think it's particularly important to highlight that moving away from international obligations is not going to be the answer that's going to solve these phenomena alone. UNHCR has been working to develop the elements of what we are referring to as a route-based approach, which aims to reduce harm along mixed movement routes, starting in countries of origin, through countries of asylum, countries of transit, and countries of destination. It also seeks to provide, working with partners, alternatives to the dangerous journeys that we see far too many refugees and migrants undertaking today along different routes, but also to help states manage more effectively mixed movements in ways that reflect and don't depart from international law. And so in this route-based approach, we're focusing with partners on 6 key pillars, which should together form part of a more comprehensive and long-term approach to tackling some of the challenges we see all along mixed movements routes all around the world. Those 6 pillars include, firstly, protection-sensitive entry management and admission in line with international refugee law. Secondly, reinforcing asylum systems as well as rights-based migration governance. Thirdly, addressing immediate protection, assistance, and humanitarian needs through humanitarian action to address basic needs, as well as seeking to provide assistance to victims of trafficking, survivors of gender-based violence, and other rights violations along routes. Fourthly, inclusion in national services and development support for host countries and host communities along key routes. Fifthly, safe and regular pathways, enabling people to move to safety in ways that don't necessitate dangerous, irregular journeys. And finally, safe and dignified returns for people who are not in need of international protection, as well as greater support to voluntary repatriation for refugees where circumstances permit. Now, this approach is going to need to involve many partners. It's not something that UNHCR can furnish or can deliver on alone. And so we'd be very glad to hear your perspectives of academic partners, as some of those who are working in the community, in civil society and elsewhere, to see how we can develop these ideas further in the most productive way along key routes. We think it's incumbent on UNHCR to seek to try and develop new ideas to tackle these challenges, and not merely to be pointing out to states what's not permitted, because it really is an environment today where it's incumbent on us to seek to propose proactive solutions and not merely draw lines about what's not permitted alone. There are two other important positive trends that I want to point to, which are also part of the future of refugee protection and where we all need to, in our view, to engage to try and further these possibilities additionally. One is building up and broadening collaboration and partners, including between and among humanitarian actors, but bringing in many other stakeholders in this realm. James highlighted the multi-stakeholder approach, which was clearly spelled out in the Global Compact on Refugees in 2018, and which has really seen the emergence of some incredibly important new ideas, grassroots initiatives and activism, and ways in which we've seen that humanitarian actors, civil society, members of communities, and refugees and migrants themselves are already involved in coming up with different and better approaches to managing these phenomena. It's also incumbent on us in the humanitarian community, in our view, to do a better job at coordinating amongst ourselves, and this will be particularly important as we face an era in which the resources available to support humanitarian action are already under pressure and might well continue to dwindle. So all of us, including UNHCR, need to be working more effectively to bring to bear our added value in particular, to perform our core mandate role, which includes supervising refugee law, but also seek to catalyse the engagement and to shore up our cooperation with others. The final point I'd like to underscore is that of refugee leadership. We see refugees that are involved increasingly in research, in writing, in advocacy, in undertaking and launching their own activities in their communities, whether that's in countries of asylum, countries to which they've been resettled, or countries in which they are transiting. And we see an incredible potential for this to really change the face of refugee protection in many important ways. Refugee-led organisations and refugees in many capacities are also producing critical analysis of their situations and sharing insights which humanitarian organisations and many others in the field don't in and of themselves have direct access to. In many cases, they're producing criticism of the way in which UNHCR, states and others are responding to their needs and plights. And this is incredibly important because we need stark and clear objective assessments of the way in which we're approaching things, but also feedback to hold us accountable and to tell us how we should be doing things differently in many ways in the modern world. We see refugees and other people with lived experience of forced displacement, statelessness, and migration, who are service providers, increasingly accessing funding from the UN and from other donors directly. We see them involved in teaching, in mentoring, in art, in a whole range of other areas which can open up our perspectives on how we should be understanding and approaching challenges, but also opportunities around mixed movements worldwide. UNHCR has its own Refugee Advisory Council, including some people who are incredibly good at speaking very plainly about the shortcomings in our approaches, and we frankly need more of that going forward into the future. So the Global Compact on Refugees, recognising the pivotal importance of, and I quote, a strong partnership and participatory approach involving refugees in leading roles, also speaks of the importance of specifically ensuring that we have leadership that is facilitated of refugee women and girls and refugee youth. And this is a crucial part of the future of refugee protection from our viewpoint. So in conclusion, it's clear that we face multiple challenges of an incredibly complex and multifaceted nature. But we also see some very clear grounds for hope and for optimism and for positive engagement. And in this environment, we think it's incumbent on UNHCR, but also others, our partners in the legal profession, in advocacy, in academia, and across all other sectors, to seek to support the arguments as to why it's in the interests of all to respect and uphold the international legal framework as a key tool, but also to approach these challenges collectively, guided by international legal principles as a firm foundation for dealing with these challenges more effectively in the future. With that, many, many thanks, and I'm looking forward to what I hope is going to be a lively discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you to you, Madeline, for those words. You covered such an extraordinary terrain in those comments, and I think so often we focus on individual contexts, or we focus on individual issues, but to see how those are all connected in the way that you presented it, I think is really critically important as we approach, research on these questions to see that broader context, but certainly when we engage in advocacy efforts and efforts around policy and in efforts around programming, to be able to keep that broader perspective in mind. And you did that marvelously. I particularly pleased to hear that your final point about the positive developments that we've seen around refugee participation. And I'd just like to say publicly how much my own research has benefited from increased meaningful partnership with those with lived experience of displacement, how it raises questions that I hadn't imagined before, but how these opportunities for solidarity and connection not only builds from the expertise of those with lived experience of displacement, but really adds legitimacy and accountability to the work that we do. So my thanks to that. I also want to put in a plug. You mentioned in really helpful details the roots-based approach to protection. So a shameless plug that Madeline will be part of a webinar on the 11th of December in conversation with two of the research chairs funded by the International Development Research Center, one from Peru, one from Morocco, really looking at a Global South perspective on this approach, which I think has real potential in sort of moving us away from the siloed approach of a state-based perspective on responses, and we'll get into that in the discussion. There's quite a bit in there, and ultimately it leaves me with the question, really two questions. One, we talk about the changes in the drivers of displacement, and it be that climate change, be it in the changing nature of conflict, the scale of conflict, and what have you. And for decades, we've struggled with this question of root causes. That the refugee regime is responsible for responding to those who are forced to flee, but how desperately we need deeper engagement. And the High Commissioner has said this at XCOM when he briefed Third Committee, time and time again. Without a functioning Security Council, without effective peace-building efforts, how much progress will we make exclusively from the perspective of humanitarian actors? But also there's a point that you raised, Madeline, that I found quite compelling about how we don't hear the good news. We don't hear those cases of day in and day out how the current international refugee protection regime provides that framework through which refugees find protection and solutions. Maybe not solutions at the numbers we would hope, but where it works, it really does work quite well. And whether we need to be doing a better job of making that substantive case for supporting the regime and focusing not just on the norms and principles of the regime, but really demonstrating that evidence. What's that empirical foundation of saying, here are all of these instances where collective action and multilateralism, where it works, where it is efficient, where it is effective. So I think that's an interesting charge and challenge to the incredibly bright graduate students that we have around the table, that's an important area that we can work on. Before we open it up for questions and begin this dialogue, I'd like to, Carol and Azadeh, from your perspectives, if there's anything that you wanted to add to that, to the presentation, or sort of the meaning of that presentation in the Canadian context, and Carol, through the work that you do, because it gave us such a framework to be able to work from. I'd just like to invite the two of you if there are points you'd like to add.
Sure. Thank you all for being here this beautiful day. Just to pick up on your last point, that yes, indeed, we tend to forget the good news stories, right? And I can confess that as a litigator, when I was litigating in Canada and defending the rights of refugees, all I saw was the negatives of the system and trying to improve the system. But looking back and stepping a little bit further away, as I have for the last almost 10 years, the truth of the matter is that Canada, the IRB, there's an 81% acceptance rate. So that means that thousands, tens of thousands of individuals are finding solutions and are being granted refugee status right here in Canada. It's quite a high acceptance rate, especially in comparison to some other countries around the world, and it's something that we don't hear enough about and we don't celebrate enough. So I completely agree with you on that, and that also Canada is a leader in terms of resettlement, and so it goes to show the value of multilateralism, and that it is. There are aspects that are working. I will pass it over to Azadeh for further comments.
I don't think I'd have much to add to that, especially on the Canadian perspective. I think we're seeing a lot more negative news nowadays with our politicians saying we need to reduce immigration, we need to reduce the numbers of people coming in. But you know, Carol and Madeline are right. There's a lot of people that are getting accepted in Canada under the refugee system. And I think a lot of advocates need to concentrate on preserving that space and ensuring that there's no backlash within the public opinion, which we are starting to see go more negative, and ensure that that system maintains its good standards and its excellent standards that we use as an example around the world. So I think that's the work going forward in Canada for sure.
And I would just underscore that point that, you know, I've and this is a safe space for me to make a confession. You know, in my own work in advocacy, I've always felt, well, I work on global issues, and there are others who work on the domestic issues in Canada. And when the High Commissioner was here in early November, he made the point: don't take for granted public support, the functioning of the system, you know, the effectiveness of policies. Don't take for granted Canadian leadership on these issues, because if to be blunt, if we lose Canada as a leader on this space, not just in terms of how the IRB is a model, how Canada's leadership in 1990 on gender-based persecution, protection of refugee women, but Canada's leadership on resettlement, complementary pathways, if we lose all of these things, then our ability to have that global conversation, I think, becomes much more challenging. So I think it's an important caution for all of us when we think about our work. Madeline, the way that you gave us, you know, we always talk about, you know, while we're planting and pruning our individual trees, let's be mindful of the forest. And I think that analogy really holds true, that our forest is not domestic or global, it's both. All right. So there's a lot there, and I know many of you have questions or comments in response to this. I want to make sure that we make good use of the time that we have for discussion.